Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Creation Myths. Today, I have for you a conversation I had with Paul Price, who is formerly of CMI, Creation Ministries International. This took place on the Standing for Truth channel, which, if you know our history, is a little bit distasteful, but many young Earth creationists will basically only talk on young Earth platforms, so you kind of have to meet people where they're at if you want to have these conversations. So you kind of balance that out, and sometimes, you know what, it's worth having the conversation, and having an opportunity to talk to Paul Price, I think, was worth it. The topic of our conversation here was historical science and our ability to draw conclusions and test hypotheses about the past. I won't say any more than that. I think it was really interesting and informative. And the example I used, I will say that the example that I like to fall back on for this conversation is the Oklo natural nuclear reactors. If you don't know what that is, stick around. It's legitimately one of the coolest things that's ever happened in the history of the world. I, in particular, think this conversation was really informative right at the end. You'll notice an inconsistency in Paul's argument. And it's really useful to see this because it pulls back the curtain on the broader young Earth approach, where the conclusions are valued much more highly than consistency in the arguments that they use. So I hope you all enjoy this. Please like, share, and comment. Thank you for watching.
And next on the panel, we've got our main event for tonight. Dr. Dan probably needs no introduction, but feel free to, Dr. Dan, introduce yourself. Actually, firstly, been a while, long time no see and talk. Hope you've been well. And so brief intro, and then pick a topic for Paul.
Hey, thank you. Sorry, I sound terrible. I'm getting over something, so my voice is it's not fun tonight. But Paul, it's a pleasure to meet you in person. We go way back on Reddit, Donnie. You probably don't know that, but me and Paul, we've been friends since years and years. We go way back. So, Paul, it's really nice to talk to you in person. I know you're getting near the end of your time. You've been on for a while, so I don't want to take too much of your time. But I really appreciate actually kind of the way that your conversation with Jackson just went there, because it was a perfect lead into what I want to talk about. What you just said a minute ago was looking at past events, all we're doing is speculating. And the big thing I want to point out to everybody is we are absolutely not just speculating when we're talking about past events and figuring out what happened in the past. You can absolutely draw really strong conclusions about what happened in the past. Sorry, I really sound terrible. I apologize, everybody. What what we can do in the when we're doing science, like the actual practice of science, the key thing that we want to be able to do is make testable predictions and then test those predictions. So we can make predictions about things that have to be the case if certain events happened in the past, and then evaluate those predictions to determine if our hypothesis about these past events is either supported and reasonable, or refuted, right? And likely not true. I only caught the very beginning of this. Sorry, everybody. I only caught the very beginning of this. And I know you were talking about radiometric dating at one point. And the example I want to use is radiometric dating. It's not my field. But it's a really cool example, so I really like it. Are you familiar with the Oklo nuclear reactors? Have you heard about this thing?
The Oklo nuclear reactors. I'm not sure I'm familiar with it.
Oh man, it's like, it is legitimately one of the coolest things that's ever happened on Earth. So the Oklo natural nuclear reactors are it's a formation in Oklo in Gabon in Central Africa, and it's a uranium mine in the 1970s. They're mining uranium, and basically they determined, based on the isotopes that they found, that it had undergone naturally occurring. I think the technical, if I want to be technically correct about it, I think it was light water nuclear fission, as would happen in a nuclear power plant, but it occurred naturally in these formations. And the really cool thing is that they determined that this happened 1.7 billion years ago. Now, obviously, nobody was there to see it, right? But because we can make predictions about if that's the case, then a bunch of things have to be true. we can evaluate if that is something that actually happened, to the point where we can be about as sure that this is a thing that happened as we are about anything you can see in front of your face. So here's what happens. So normally in uranium now, the fissionable isotope of uranium is U-235 is what they use in like power plants. And when you mine it now, the that uranium, it decays naturally, so it's only present at like 0.7 something percent. But when they mined it in Oklo in the 70s, it was lower than that. It was like 0.6 something, whatever it was. There was a discrepancy there, and everyone kind of freaked out a little bit because like it was a French operation and they were making nuclear weapons, and you got to account for all your uranium, right? So everyone freaked out a little bit, and they had to figure out what happened to the missing uranium. And what they determined, they said it sure looks like it fissioned away, like it did a nuclear power plant, right? It didn't decay faster. It fissioned, it split in this kind of artificial way. Um, if that's the case, then there's a whole bunch of things that have to be true, right? So if that happens, you can kind of wind back the clock based on the decay rate and say the most recent time it would have been at a high enough concentration to do fission would have been 1.7 billion years ago. So let's say 1.7 billion. And then if that happened, what else has to be true, right? So if we did fission at 1.7 billion years ago, and it worked the same way back then that fission works today, and the nuclear decay works the same way since then to present as it does today, and neutron capture, this other process where nuclei can increase in mass rather than decrease, if that works the same, right? All
Okay.
these things working the same way since then, we can predict very precisely what other isotopes we ought to see in that formation, right? That are weird, except for the fact that this fission occurred in a certain quantity, and we know the
Yeah, I
quantity based on
I
the missing
follow.
uranium,
I think I
right?
follow what you're getting at here. The
Yeah.
problem
So
is,
the punchline, Paul, is that all of these predictions are dead on accurate, and they're all independent of each other, right? So the fact that fission works the same way is independent of decay working the same way. Decay and fission are independent of neutron capture, which confirms that the fine structure constant has actually been constant for 1.7 billion years. They tested like literally dozens of isotopes when they were figuring out what was going on here. Different uranium isotopes, xenon. My favorite is samarium, where it was samarium 150 was enriched from 149 based on the exact amount of neutron capture you would expect from fission of the exact amount of missing uranium. So this is what you would call historical science, right? It's something that happened in the past, but nobody was there to observe it. We didn't directly do an experiment, but we can make predictions that are extremely specific. And when all of these different predictions are confirmed, we have a pretty good idea of what happened at that time in the past. I would love
yeah,
to hear your
I
answer to
I
that.
follow what you're
Go
saying,
ahead.
and obviously, since I'm not familiar with this particular set of claims that you're making here about the Oklo reactor and all of these different things, I'm not going to be able to give you a detailed response like off the cuff right now on this specific topic. I'll definitely look into this and possibly, talk about this in the future in a future open mic or a future presentation or whatever. Um, but I can make some statements generally about the types of statements that you were just making. And one of the places where you can sneak in bias without realizing it is when you make statements like, it would have to be the case that. And that is the type of statement that, you have to be careful, because you may be incorrect about that, and you may be basing it on assumptions that you don't even realize you're making when you say it would have to be the case that. Um, so that type of language, when you're talking about, again, something that has not been observed, and it's not only millions but billions of years in the past, to make a kind of statement, it would have to be the case, is a definite example of hubris that happens with people without realizing that they're overstating their own knowledge. Um, Specifically, I saw in the chat where you stated that there is no distinction between operational and historical science. Is that right?
I don't want to go down the philosophy of science rabbit hole. I'd rather keep things kind of focused on
I mean,
the
that's
specific
the topic of
practice of
this. Yeah,
science.
but that is the topic of the presentation I gave, and I did see where you stated that the entire distinction is made up. Is that
Yeah,
what
in
you
the
believe?
practice of science, yeah, when you're doing science, it doesn't matter historical or operational. It's all the same. The point is that you're able to make testable predictions about occurrences, right? And it doesn't matter if those occurrences are things that you're doing in a petri dish in the lab, or if those are occurrences that happened 1.7 billion years ago in a uranium mine in Central Africa. It doesn't matter. The point is that you can make accurate predictions. And to what you said a moment ago, you said the kind of the assumption that's being snuck in here, right? As you can say, it would have to be. Well, that's the whole point of the scientific method is you eliminate potential explanations. So you say, okay, we can have an alternative explanation, for example, right? You could say, well, maybe the decay was more rapid for some reason, right? The uranium decay explains the discrepancy. It wasn't fission, it was this other thing. But if you have decay that's inconsistent with the observations, right? We have direct observations of the isotopes that are there. Accelerated decay is inconsistent with those observations for two reasons. One, it doesn't account for the heat. And two, the decay chain, the isotopes that we would find are different from what we find as the products of fission. So we can eliminate that as a potential explanation, right? So when I say it would have to be, what I mean is that we can test a bunch of different hypotheses based on the direct observations we make, and we can eliminate the ones that are inconsistent with those
Yeah,
observations.
you
For this particular site, the only hypothesis that's been proposed that is consistent with all of the observations is fission 1.7 billion years ago.
okay? I mean, I think you're making a statement that exceeds the actual evidence. But again, since this isn't something I've studied myself in the past, I can't go into a lot of detail on it. I will say that testable predictions are great. But the real thing that differentiates operational science from historical science is falsifiability. It's not
Mhm.
testable predictions. I mean, I can make testable predictions and I can be right about, I can say if a hobo went into my backyard last night, I'm going to make a testable prediction. He might have left an article of clothing behind that I would be able to find. So that would be a testable prediction. And then I could go into my backyard and I could look and I could actually find an article of clothing. And so my prediction was confirmed. But does that prove that a hobo was really in my backyard last night? No. You know why? Because it could have been that one of my kids actually dropped that article of clothing and I just didn't recognize it. And so the point I'm making here not equate to a proof of your that your hypothesis is correct. Falsification is what we use in operational science. We don't prove something true. I'm sure you understand this as a scientist. We don't prove scientific theories. We fail to disprove them, right? And so, but you can't disprove anything about the past. That is the distinction.
So I totally agree that the point is falsifiability, and that's the point of these testable predictions is falsifiability. So, for example, that very last thing you said is where I take issue. Right, we can disprove things about the past. 100% we can. So, for example, in the Oklo example, we've disproven that there was accelerated decay of uranium 235 there. Like that didn't happen because we know what decay of uranium 235 looks like. We know what the products of that are, and that's not what we
Yeah, you
find
think
in
you
the.
know all of these things, but you can't actually prove that you know it because you can't observe it. You have no way to do a sanity check other than, I would say,
If I may, we can observe that though. We can directly observe the fission of U-235. We know exactly what that is based on
yeah,
current
that's
observations. Now you
operational
can
science.
say, right, and now you can say, but it might have been different in the past. And the point of this example is so beautiful because it allows us directly to test, does that, let's call it an assumption, does that assumption that this process worked in the past the same as it does in the present, it allows us to test that as a
Well,
hypothesis, right? Because if the products are different, right, from what we expect based on what we're proposing, then something else is happening there that we can't
Yeah.
explain, right? But it's not. It's exactly what we would expect based on how these processes work in the present. So I totally agree with you that the point is falsifiability, where I need to clarify, I think, is that the point of testable predictions is to provide that standard for falsifiability. And if, for example, in this particular, situation, if there hadn't been the enriched heavier isotope of samarium, then we have falsified fission as an explanation for
No,
the
because finding what
irregularity
you
we were seeing
expect to
there.
find doesn't prove that you're correct.
I didn't
Failing
say
to
it did.
find what you don't expect to find also doesn't prove you're correct. Not in
I
history, because there
haven't
are
used the
there
word
are
prove at all.
conceivable ways that, unbeknownst to any of us, some of the assumptions that you're making about what you think you should find could turn out to be false. That's why it's not really falsification. And another point that I'll make is, um, that I am not merely saying that decay rates might have been different in the past. Now, that could be true. They might have been different, but that's not the only way we could go about approaching this topic of radiometric decay. It's also possible that we simply don't know enough about how decay works in the present. I'm not even talking about it might have been different in the past. I'm saying our understanding of physics is incomplete. And so to suggest that we know enough about present processes to extrapolate them successfully over a span of time greater than anybody can even conceive of is very much an arrogant thing to do. And the billiard ball example I gave in my talk was try to show that point. If we can't even successfully predict the motion of a billiard ball for more than a couple of seconds, then how is it that we think we're smart enough to say with confidence that something must be the case a billion years ago? I'm not willing to say that. I'm going to say I'm going to trust the historical record before I trust those types of speculations. And I do think, unfortunately, it does not speak to your intellectual honesty that during my presentation you went in there and made comments as I was speaking that this entire thing that I'm talking about is made up, even as I was giving quotations from secular evolutionary scientists who are using the distinction, and they mean by it the same thing that I mean by it, but nonetheless you continue to claim that it's a completely made up distinction. And unfortunately that shows that you have been to a certain degree indoctrinated not to think critically about this distinction. But with that, I don't think there's anything I've got more time to talk on with you tonight, uh, as I'm running out of time here. But I do appreciate you bringing up the Okla. How do you spell it? I'll look it
Oklo,
up.
Oklo, Oklo. And Donnie,
OKLO.
if I may, Paul, I have one quick thing just to kind of leave you with, if that's
Yeah,
okay. Because like I said, I'm not here to argue the distinction. I will just say on that like scientists are not a monolith. Like we disagree about stuff. So yeah, a philosopher of science can say whatever, and I can disagree, and that's how stuff works. Um, I do agree. I want to agree with you though that like there could be some weird thing, right? There could be some weird thing going on with Oklo and whatever. There could be some weird thing that we don't understand based on our current observations of how things like fission and decay and neutron capture work. That could totally be the case. I 100% agree with you. But I think it is weird that you would propose that as an explanation rather than going based on the processes that we can directly observe, right, in real time in the present, and saying those, based on our direct observations, probably are right the things that are operating. Because again, it's all about direct observation.
yeah.
So
I mean, that makes
I don't think we should appeal to things that are unknown and unobservable,
well.
right? I think
I
that's if we
understand.
have observations, we should use those.
I
That's what I'm
understand the
saying.
point you're making there, Dan, and I agree with you that if I were making that statement in a vacuum, it wouldn't hold a lot of water. Like if that were all we had to go on, then what leg would I have to stand on just by saying, "Well, you might be wrong." Yeah, I can see that point, but we're not in a vacuum. We do have a historical record of what has happened on this earth.
Mhm.
So I'm not willing to take those types of speculations, as impressive as they may be, I'm not willing to jettison what the people that were there actually told us over those types of speculations. We have a historical document that tells us the history of this planet. It's called the Bible. And so you may feel that you're within your intellectual license to disregard the history that it gives us. I don't. And I don't find these types of speculations sufficiently convincing to cause me to want to disbelieve what God told us in his word actually happened. So that's my response to you, is that I'm not saying that in a vacuum. I have a higher authority that I'm appealing to that gives us the history of this planet from an eyewitness perspective, and that is always going to be more reliable than people saying this must be the case because of such and such measurement. We think we can't imagine why we would be wrong here. Sorry, it doesn't overturn the Bible for me.
I wouldn't assume it would. Thank you. I appreciate chatting
Yeah.
with you. I'd love to chat with you more sometime.
Sure.
Thanks, Donnie. Appreciate the time.
Okay, Dr. Dan, thank you so much for joining. Paul and Dan, I appreciate the back and forth. Very interesting back and forth discussions.